Welcome to the Monday edition of the Christian Science Monitor. My name is Pam, and here is our first article. Keystone XL Pipeline loses its Clean Water Act permits. The disputed pipeline project faces another significant hurdle because a U.S. judge canceled a key permit over concerns for endangered species. Tribal leaders and residents are asking for a complete halt of the construction during the pandemic. By Matthew Brown, Associated Press. A U.S. judge canceled a key permit on Wednesday for the Keystone XL oil pipeline that's expected to stretch from Canada to Nebraska, another setback for the disputed project that got underway less than 2 weeks ago, following years of delays. Judge Brian Morris said the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers failed to adequately consider effects on endangered species such as pallid sturgeon, a massive dinosaur-like fish that lives in rivers the pipeline would cross. The ruling, however, does not shut down work that has begun at the U.S.-Canada border crossing in Montana, according to attorneys in the case. Pipeline sponsors TC Energy will need the permit for future construction across hundreds of rivers and streams along Keystone's 1,200-mile route. It creates another significant hurdle for the project, says Anthony Swift with Natural Resource Defense Council, one of the groups that challenges the permit. Regardless of whether they have the cross-border segment, Keystone XL has basically lost all its Clean Water Act permits for water crossings, he said. TC Energy was reviewing the ruling but remained committed to building this important energy infrastructure project, spokesman Terry Kuna said. Officials with the Army Corps of Engineers did not have an immediate response to the ruling. The Keystone authorization came under a so-called nationwide permit issued by the Corps in 2017, essentially giving blanket approval to pipeline or similar utility projects with minimal effect on waterways. The cancellation could have broader implications because it appears to invalidate dredging work for any project authorized under the 2017 permit, said attorney Jared Margolis with the Center for Biological Diversity, another plaintiff in the case. It's unclear what projects would be included. Mr. Morris is holding a court hearing on Thursday on two other lawsuits against the $8 billion pipeline. American Indian tribes and environmental groups want him to halt the construction at the border, while a lawsuit challenging President Donald Trump's approval of the pipeline last year works its way through the courts. The pipeline was proposed in 2008 and would carry up to 830 barrels, or 35 million gallons, of crude daily to Nebraska, where it would be transferred to another TC Energy pipeline for shipment to refineries and export terminals on the Gulf of Mexico. It was rejected twice under the Obama administration because of concerns that it could worsen climate change. Then Mr. Trump revived it. TC Energy's surprise March 31st announcement that it intended to start construction amid a global economic crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic came after the provincial government in Alberta invested $1.1 billion to jumpstart the work. Tribal leaders and some residents of rural communities along the pipeline's route worry that thousands of workers needed for the project could spread the virus. As many as 11 construction camps, some housing up to 1,000 people, were initially planned for the project. TC Energy says those are under review among the pandemic and won't be needed until later in the summer. Work on two camps in Montana and South Dakota could start as soon as this month, according to court documents filed by the company this week. This story was reported by the Associated Press. Our next article is titled, California to Give Relief Funds to Undocumented Immigrants. We feel a deep sense of gratitude, California's governor said about his decision to help undocumented immigrants, 10% of the state workforce amid the pandemic shutdowns. Opponents say there are more urgent needs for the $75 million. By Adam Beam, Associated Press. California will be the first state to give cash to immigrants living in the country illegally who are hurt by the coronavirus, offering $500 apiece to 150,000 adults who were left out of the $2.2 trillion stimulus package approved by Congress. Many Americans began receiving $1,200 checks from the federal government this week, and others who are unemployed are getting an additional $600 a week from the government that has ordered them to stay home and disrupted what had been a roaring economy. But people living in the country illegally are not eligible for any of that money, and advocates have been pushing for states to fill the gap. Wednesday, Governor Gavin Newsom announced he would spend $75 million of taxpayers' money to create a disaster relief fund for immigrants living in the country illegally. We feel a deep sense of gratitude for people that are in fear of deportation that are still addressing essential needs of tens of millions of Californians, said Mr. Newsom, who noted 10% of the state's workforce are immigrants living in the country illegally who paid more than $2.5 billion in state and local taxes last year. Senator Republican leader Shannon Grove said Mr. Newsom should spend the money instead on food banks, equipment for students to continue their education online, and local governments struggling with revenue losses. Instead of meeting these urgent needs, Governor Newsom has chosen to irresponsibly pursue a left-wing path and unilaterally secure $125 million for undocumented immigrants, says Mrs. Grove, who represents Bakerfield. California has an estimated 2.2 million immigrants living in the country illegally, the most of any state, according to the Pew Research Center. State officials won't decide who gets the money. Instead, the state will give the money to a network of regional nonprofits to find and vet potential recipients. Advocates say that's key to making the plan work because immigrants are unlikely to contact the government for fear of deportation. You need to use organizations that have trusted relationships with these families, says Jacqueline Martinez, CEO of the Latino Community Foundation. A group of charities has committed to raising another $50 million for the fund from private donors, potentially offering benefits to another 100,000 people. But that money will have fewer limitations, meaning grants could be more than $500 or less, depending on the cost of living where a person lives. Organizers began raising money on Friday and have raised more than $6 million so far, with contributions from the Emerson Collective, Blue Shield of California Foundation, the California Endowment, the James Irvine Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and an anonymous donor. We want this to be as equitable as possible and benefit as many people as possible, said Darani Petzad, president of Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. California has been the most aggressive state in the nation when it comes to giving benefits to immigrants living in the country illegally. Last year, California became the first state to give taxpayer-funded health benefits to low-income adults 25 and younger living in the country illegally. This year, Mr. Newsom had proposed expanding those benefits to seniors 65 and older. The spending announced Wednesday means Mr. Newsom has committed to spending more than $2 billion responding to the coronavirus, an extraordinary amount in just over 1 month. Thursday, state lawmakers are scheduled to have their first oversight hearing of Mr. Newsom's spending. California has more than 26,600 confirmed coronavirus cases and more than 850 deaths, according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. Those numbers are far behind other virus hotspots in the United States, like New York and New Jersey, which public health officials attribute to the state's aggressive implementation of physical distancing and stay-at-home orders. Since mid-March 2.7 million Californians have filed for unemployment benefits, more than all of the claims California processed in 2019 combined. The state's Employment Development Department has been overwhelmed, causing delays for many people seeking assistance. Wednesday, Mr. Newsom announced the state's call center will expand its hours to 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. 7 days a week. More than 1,300 state employees have been reassigned to help process the claims, and Mr. Newsom said the state will begin distributing federal unemployment benefits by the end of the month to people who usually aren't eligible for them, including the gig workers and the self-employed. At least 5 other states are already issuing those benefits, prompting criticism from some state lawmakers. The people in Sacramento are making promises, and the bureaucracies and the technology are failing the people, Republican State Assemblyman Jim Patterson said. She was forced to marry a warlord. This is our next article. She was forced to marry a warlord. Now she's helping survivors heal. Evelyn Amany's Women's Advocacy Network helps survivors of conflict in Uganda, particularly those abducted by the Lord's Resistance Army, by John Okot, contributor. The crowd ululated and cheered as Santa Aber and her daughter stepped out of the dust-streaked car. Nearly all the residents of this small village in northern Uganda had come out to welcome the women in their new home. 2 decades ago, at the age of 14, Miss Abner was abducted from a nearby village by the Lord's Resistance Army, a rebel group that waged a violent civil war in this part of Uganda from the late 1980s until the mid-2000s. She escaped in 2005 with a daughter she had with an LRA commander she was forced to marry. But she couldn't go home. Her family refused to take her back, as is true for many children abducted by the LRA. And so for the next 15 years, she lived alone in a rundown hut, washing clothes for local families. Then last year, she heard about a group called the Women's Advocacy Network, or WAN, which helps reunite LRA abductees with their families. Her own family wouldn't accept her back, she knew, but perhaps the family of her daughter's father would. The group began quiet negotiations on her behalf, and 2 months later, she was here. It was an unusual homecoming to a place she had never before lived, but she stepped into Atanga that day in February. Miss Aber felt relief. "I have a home now," she said, her eyes filling with tears. WAN founder Evelyn Amany, who had brokered the reunion, watched the scene with a biting mix of joy and anguish. This was the 54th time her organization had reunited an LRA abductee with her family, bringing an end to years of wandering and suffering. And each of those 54 times, she wondered when her own turn would come. From child to wife. In 1994, when Mrs. Amany was a preteen, she was kidnapped by the LRA rebels while walking home from school near Gulu, northern Uganda's main city. By that time, the LRA had been fighting a brutal guerrilla war in northern Uganda for several years. Its goal was to overthrow the country's national government, which had subjected the country's north to decades of neglect and abuse, and establish a theocracy. But the LRA struggled to find recruits, so it simply began to kidnap them. Children were an easy target, according to United Nations Refugee Agency. The LRA abducted at least 30,000 children between 1987 and 2006. Boys became soldiers, girls fought too, and many also became wives to the Army commanders. Ms. Amany was 14 and working as a house servant for the LRA leader, Joseph Kony, when he called her to his house alongside his 24 wives. From this day forward, he announced, Miss Amany would be his wife too. "I asked him, 'How can I be your wife when up until this point you have called me your child?' she recalls. He said, 'You have no choice.'" 8 years later, Mrs. Amany and her 3 children were in an LRA camp in what is now South Sudan, where the Ugandan military attacked. In the chaos, she grabbed for her children, but only found 2 sets of little hands. "I watched my other child slip through my fingers," says Mrs. Amany. "I have searched for her ever since. The Ugandan military took her into custody for 8 months. When she was released, she went immediately back to her home village, only to find her family had disowned her. They would often say, 'Kony's children are still alive, but our children are all buried,'" she said. Ms. Amany had also adopted 2 of Mr. Kony's other children, whom she met while in Ugandan custody. Topic: healing together. So she left for Gulu, where she enrolled in a government-sponsored tailoring course at a local Roman Catholic school. Soon after, in 2006, she was chosen to represent former abductees at a series of peace talks between the LRA and the Ugandan government. The experience was a revelation. She was not alone or powerless. Ms. Amany and a group of women she had met at the peace talks and in Gulu decided to form a small organization to help each other save money. They called it Rot Lakika, which means God is merciful. As members grew and the women grew close, they began to speak to each other about the traumas they had endured at the hand of the LRA. For many, There was a deep relief in breaking the shameful silence around their experience of abduction, rape, and captivity. Soon the group began helping survivors tell their stories more publicly at community gatherings, on radio talk shows, and in a book they published about women's experiences under the LRA. Renaming itself the Women's Advocacy Network, the organization also forms small groups in villages across the region where women can talk about the challenges of coming home, from stigma to poverty to the pain of searching for lost loved ones. They've helped each other find economic security, too, with job training and livestock purchasing programs. Next topic, one family at a time. But their work at times has seemed endless. The two-decade LRA insurgency has led to the deaths of 12,000 people in northern Uganda and uprooted 1.5 million people. By 2009, the LRA had been driven out of Uganda and its hostages have slowly trickled back to their homes. But they continue to face rejection, particularly children fathered by LRA rebels and their mothers. Miss Aber's father, for example, said he could not welcome her back into the home because you had a child with the devil. In cases like this one, Ms. Amini, who first met Miss Aber when they were both being held by the LRA, and her team act as detectives. They asked the abductees to tell them anything she can remember about her child's father: family name, clan name, village, lineage, and family stories. Then they used their own network of informants, WANs, more than 900 members across northern Uganda, to find the family. It didn't take long to establish that Miss Abner's child's father came from a village called Atanga. From there, Miss Amini brokered a meeting with local leaders and eventually with the man's family. Yes, the family said their son had been abducted too, and yes, he had died while serving as an LRA commander. They agreed that Miss Abner and her daughter were their family too and promised to take them in. On the evening of the reunion, as locals continued to ululate and dance to a convulsive local beat called, oh heavens to Betsy's, Lakabukubu, Miss Amini watched from afar. She was happy for them, but another thought pressed down on her, heavy and aching. My plan is to continue helping as many returnees as I can, she said, but I hope my daughter will one day return back home. Next article is titled, How Leaders Use Emergency Power to Target Journalists and Critics. From Hungary to Thailand, new emergency powers are helping leaders keep a tight lid on public dissent during the pandemic. Human rights advocates say some regimes are exploiting misinformation laws to target journalists and political critics. By Grant Peck and Priyapa T. Kunsong, Associated Press. Health concerns were on artist Danai Usama's mind when he returned to Thailand last month from a trip to Spain. He noticed he and his fellow passengers did not go through medical checks after arriving at Bangkok's airport and thought it worth noting on his Facebook page. The airport authorities denied it, lodging a complaint with police, and he was arrested at his gallery in Phuket for violating the Computer Crime Act by allegedly posting false information, an offense punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment and a fine of $3,000. Mr. Danai told the Associated Press that his Facebook post, though public, was really meant just for a small circle of 40 to 50 people. Instead, it went viral. He believes the government is afraid its opponents would use his observation as proof it was failing the fight against the coronavirus and acted against him as a warning to others. As governments across the world enact emergency measures to keep people at home and stave off the pandemic, some are unhappy about having their missteps publicized. Others are taking advantage of the crisis to silence critics and tighten control. COVID-19 poses significant threats to government and regime security as it has the potential to expose poor governance and lack of transparency on issues that affect every citizen in a given country, said Aim Singpen, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Sydney. As the pandemic is a global issue and is constantly on the news around the world, governments have a harder time controlling messages to the public without exposing how little or how much they do in comparison to other countries around the world, she said in an email interview. In Cambodia, where Prime Minister Hun Sen has been in power for 35 years, human rights group Lakadho has documented 24 cases of people being detained for sharing information about the coronavirus. They include 4 supporters of the dissolved opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party. Human Rights Watch also reported the arrest and questioning of a 14-year-old who expressed fear on social media about rumors of positive COVID-19 cases at her school and in her province. The group withheld more details to safeguard the girl's privacy. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orbán may have been the most adroit at exploiting the health crisis. His country's parliament granted him the power to rule indefinitely by decree, unencumbered by existing laws or judicial or parliamentary restraints. One aspect of the law, ostensibly passed to cope with the coronavirus, calls for prison terms of up to 5 years for those convicted of spreading falsehoods or distorted facts during the emergency. The global health problems caused by COVID-19 require effective measures to protect people's healths and lives, acknowledged Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights Dunja Mihajlović. This includes combating disinformation that may cause panic and social unrest. But, she said, regrettably, some governments are using this imperative as a pretext to introduce disproportionate restrictions to press freedom. This is a counterproductive approach that must stop, particularly in times of crisis. We need to protect our precious liberties and rights. Lawmakers in the Philippines last month passed special legislation giving President Rodrigo Duterte emergency power. Mr. Duterte, already criticized for a brutal war on drugs that had left thousands dead and been fiercely belligerent towards critics. The new law makes spreading false information regarding the COVID-19 crisis on social media and other platforms a criminal offense, punishable by up to 2 months in jail and fines of up to $19,500. At least 2 reporters have been charged by police with spreading false information about the crisis. It is fearful that Duterte will use his increased authority to quell dissent and further pounce on his political enemies, says Ari Argugay, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of the Philippines. Egypt expelled a correspondent for the British newspaper The Guardian over a report citing a study that challenged the official count of coronavirus cases. Iraq suspended the operations of the Reuters news agency for 3 months and imposed a fine of about $20,800 for reporting that the actual number of infections and deaths was vastly more than the government acknowledged. Reuters stands by its story. In Siberia, police briefly detained a journalist, Anna Lalick, who wrote about a lack of protective equipment and chaotic conditions at a large hospital complex. The clinical center said her article disturbed the public and hurt the image of the health organization. The government also closed its daily coronavirus news conference for journalists, asking them to send their questions by email. It said it meant to stop the spread of the virus, but rights groups and independent media decried it as a form of censorship. A state of emergency invoked in late March gives Thailand's Prime Minister Prayuth Chan-o-cha extraordinary powers to fight COVID-19, including censoring the media. More than a dozen people in Thailand are reported to have been arrested on charges related to spreading coronavirus misinformation. Thailand's top public health expert deserves credit for their sincere efforts to counter misinformation, said Joel Selway, an associate professor of political science at Brigham Young University, who has published a book on politics and health policies in developing countries. This doesn't mean that Prayuth-led government would not also take advantage of this to crush political opponents, he added. Artist Denai, who said he will contest the charge against him, admits to regrets over writing his Facebook post about his airport arrival. If I had known that it would be in so much trouble like this, I wouldn't have written it, he said. I have never been arrested nor gone to court before. I was handcuffed and slept overnight in a police station cell. I was devastated, actually. It affects my family and myself. But deep down inside, I would have wanted to write it anyway. This story was reported by the Associated Press AP correspondents Pablo Garandi in Budapest, Hungary, Dusan Stojanovic in Belgrade, Serbia, Sofeng Chiang in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, Busaba Silvasambun in Bangkok, and Jim Gomez in Manila, Philippines contributed to this report. Next article is titled, Coronavirus Tests Global Sense of Who Wins, Me or Us, by Ned Timenko, correspondence. London. This past week, the 27-nation European Union came close to a breaking point, and while it managed to stave off the danger for now, its crisis has dramatically highlighted a key challenge from COVID-19 for national governments around the world. It is forcing them to make an age-old human choice between me and us. For individuals, that means balancing personal needs with those of other people in the communities, societies, countries, and world of which we're all a part. For governments, not just in Europe but elsewhere, the spread of COVID-19 has meant choosing between their national interests and a broader international engagement to confront a virus that holds no passport and recognizes no borders. So far, at least, nationalism, the me, is winning. And one major question when the crisis has finally passed will be whether the increasing fragile architecture of existing international relationships, political alliances, trade partnerships, and the global economic system as a whole can or will be built back to anything like its former self. That's likely to take on even greater importance with recent signs that China, the initial source of the coronavirus, does have a coherent and assertive international strategy for a post-pandemic world. The EU's COVID-19 reckoning is especially telling because the EU should have been singularly well placed to mount a transnational response when the pandemic started, hitting member states early this year. The EU began life as a trading partnership, yet in recent decades it has become a fully fledged single market with shared passport, a shared currency, and an explicitly stated aim of achieving a similar level of political integration. The official phrase is ever closer union, implying a kind of United States of Europe. Subject: COVID-19 has put that vision to an unprecedented test. The immediate response in February and early March, as the pandemic struck with particular force in 3 member states, Italy, Spain, and France, was hardly an example of ever closer union. A number of states tightened or closed their borders, with pressure to ensure adequate supplies of equipment. Some EU states also briefly banned exports to the worst-hit areas in Italy and Spain. Some of this was simply a gut public health reaction to the sudden spread of the virus, but the real fault line inside the EU and the cause of last week's crisis involves what might be called the second pandemic, the huge economic cost of the shutdown being used to stem the spread of COVID-19. It essentially pits Germany and other wealthy, fiscally conservative states in Northern Europe against more heavily indebted countries in the South. The aftermath is going to require similar huge government expenditures and ultimately borrowing. Since 2 of the countries most severely hit, Italy and Spain, are already heavily indebted, the argument they've been making is for the EU truly to act like a union, to use the northern states' more solid credit rating as a ballast, and to borrow as a single bloc to rebuild as a single bloc by issuing so-called EU corona bonds. But Germany, Australia, the Netherlands, Finland, and other northern states wanted no part of an arrangement linking their finances to what they view as a fiscally imprudent South. The issue was finally finessed by a $550 billion package of EU support payments, but the corona bond issue remains on the table to be considered by the heads of government against the background of a warning from Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte that it represented a challenge to the existence of the EU. Next topic, beyond Europe. The COVID-19 crisis has seen me trump over us elsewhere in the world as well. Not only have borders been closed and transport links severed, just as within the EU, countries large and small have been scouring worldwide for supplies of ventilators and other items while seeking to restrict the export of such equipment available domestically. So far, at least, efforts to coordinate a concerted international response have foundered. A recent conference call meeting of the Group of Seven, the world's leading economies, failed even to issue a joint statement due to objections over a U.S. insistence that it include a reference to COVID-19 as the Wuhan virus. U.S. President Donald Trump has also retreated from past administration's leadership roles in containing international health crisis, disregarding calls for the creation of an international task force. This week, he announced plans for the U.S., the principal donor to the World Health Organization, to suspend its funding. There does seem to be a growing recognition among other G7 members, the major European states, Canada, and Japan, of the potential enormous threat the pandemic still poses to less developed nations and refugee populations. Britain, for instance, has announced additional funding for international relief organizations and for WHO. Still, the main me virus versus us test may lie ahead as countries decide whether or to what degree to re-engage internationally as they cope with the inevitable challenge of rebuilding their domestic economies. Both politically and economically, there have been signs that one issue above all may determine which way they move: relations with China. Economically, the scramble for equipment to deal with COVID-19 has underscored the degree to which China has become an indispensable part of the global supply chain, not just for consumer products or manufacturing components, but countless other products, including critical ventilators and protective equipment. Politically, that's become part of China's own strategy to burnish its image and maximize its influence as the pandemic spreads more widely. In recent weeks, it has made high-profile deliveries to a number of areas in need of supplies, including Italy, Canada, Britain, and New York State in the U.S. At the same time, it has been reframing the narrative around COVID-19, a virus whose existence it at first hid from view, and whose origins and extent it has so far chosen not to share in full detail. Instead, Beijing is now trumpeting its success in containing the spread within China, in clear contrast to the response of badly sketched health systems in Western democracies like the U.S. and a number of EU member states. Well, my friends, that concludes this Monday's reading of the Christian Science Monitor. This is Pam saying stay safe inside and out of harm's way. Make it a great day.